Hey there, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the constraining capacity of the law. And if you haven't read through the notes for the jurisprudential regimes section, I think you should pause now and go back to that. We're going to discuss some things in this lecture that followed directly from some of the things we talked about during jurisprudential regimes. And it's just going to be easier if you go do that first. So go back and make sure you familiarize yourself with scrutiny, levels of scrutiny, and the grain of doctrine, okay? What we're going to talk about today is a little bit more about whether or not the law matters. We know from previous conversations we've had in this class that the law does matter in some way, but not in the way that classical thinking about the law mattered. Once upon a time, proponents of the legal model suggested that stare decisis mattered and that precedent was simply followed because it was precedent. We know now that that's not the case. But what we do see, and this is what we learn in the jurisprudential regimes stuff, is that the rules the court creates for itself are the ones that matter. Okay, when they create something like a test or a standard that future courts and lower courts should look at, those things end up mattering. Okay, they end up changing the outcomes in predictable ways. So while the justices don't seem to follow stare decisis, or the idea that let precedent stand, they do seem to follow jurisprudential regimes such that their decisions are guided by the rules that they themselves or the previous courts have created. Okay. But we also know that they're policy seekers. Like other politicians, the justices are trying to achieve their policy preferences as often as they possibly can. One of the other things we talked about at various points throughout the semester, in particular with regards to setting the agenda, is that sometimes law and policy interact with one another to produce various outcomes. Okay, so sometimes the law actually frees a justice to behave in a manner consistent with policy. A lot of times we think of the law as a constraint, but sometimes it's actually it gets rid of constraints. It stops imposing constraints and it creates this freedom to choose policy if one wishes. Okay, so there are times when the law is constraining, but there are other times where it's free. When the law is not constraining, we can say it's freeing, such that the justices can behave attitudinally. Okay, but where we're going to go today and what we're going to talk about is that sometimes the law is more constraining than at other times. Okay, and this is what we're going to see. We're going to take that logic from the jurisprudential regimes lesson and apply it in a way that the various levels of scrutiny are actually just differing levels of constraint. Okay. This is what one researcher, Bartels, argues. He says that those legal rules, things like creating levels of scrutiny, strict scrutiny, intermediate, it permits varying degrees of what he calls ideological discretion. So if the justices had their way, they could use their ideology as the sole determiner of all behaviors 100% of the time. They could always vote how they wanted. They'd never be constrained in any meaningful way. But we know that's just not how it actually shakes out. So Bartels suggests that legal rules like those ones that jurisprudential regimes can create, what they end up doing is allowing varying degrees of ideological discretion such that sometimes the justices are allowed to use ideology and other times they're really not. Okay, so sometimes their choices are influenced a great deal by ideology. Other times they're influenced just a little bit by ideology. And sometimes they're barely influenced by ideology. And Bartels argues that we can look at various legal rules and determine how important ideology is in the outcome in predictable ways. Okay, so these legal rules dictate what choice can be influenced by ideology, and you'll see more what I mean by that in a couple of seconds here. Another way that I like to think about this is that legal rules can tune how much ideology matters, right? Ideology is a scale, or like the effect of ideology, think of it as, like a knob on an old school amp or on a radio or whatever, where you can turn it all the way down to 0 so that the effective ideology is very low, or you can crank it up to 11 such that the effective ideology is very important. Okay, but legal rules are the tuning element. Okay, the legal rule depends on what setting on the dial you turn the little knob to for the effective ideology. Okay, the reason that this kind of requires a little bit of explanation is because this is the opposite of what we usually think rules are doing. A lot of times, excuse me, generally we think of rules as being a constraint on one's ability to act, right? You are not allowed to do a certain thing because the rules say so. But the way that Bartels thinks about it is that maybe rules actually open the doors for ideology to matter in certain situations. So he's arguing that some rules actually allow the justices to behave as they wish to behave. It gets rid of some of the constraint. Okay. Okay. So let me just run you through the levels of scrutiny again. You should remember this from the jurisprudential regimes lesson. If not, go back there or just hang on here, right? So Bartels uses the same levels of scrutiny as the previous lesson, Richards and Kritzer's jurisprudential regimes. So remember, strict scrutiny is the highest level. It's the most rights protective. The government has to show why it restricted a right, and the assumption is that the government's going to lose. Okay, next level is intermediate. That's sort of the medium level. The government needs to justify their rights restriction, but the person also needs to show that their rights have actually been infringed upon. The burden is partially shared by both parties, and there's no presumption of an outcome. Sometimes the government wins, sometimes the individual wins when intermediate scrutiny is used. The final one is rational basis. It's the lowest level of scrutiny. All the government needs to do here is show that they have a legitimate, or that there's a rational connection between their rule and some legitimate government interest. It's the least rights protective, and the presumption is that the government will win the case or the individual will lose the case. Okay. So there's two models of the constraining capacity of the law. And what that means is how these rules, how these levels of scrutiny might potentially constrain justices or not. Okay. The first one is called the legal presumptions model. Remember on that last slide, I said the presumption for strict scrutiny is that the government will lose. The presumption for rational basis is that the government will win. And the presumption for intermediate is, well, it's kind of a coin toss. Either one could win. So in the first model of the constraining capacity, the legal presumptions model, those presumptions matter a great deal. Okay. So basically, constraint is a function of how strongly those legal rules presume a certain case outcome. Again, this is what I just mentioned, right? For strict scrutiny, the presumptions the government loses, rational basis they win, intermediate, no presumed outcome. So when this is true, the justices don't have as many legally justifiable alternatives as they normally would. Okay, imagine a world where there's no legal rule, where there's no connection between strict scrutiny and the presumption that the government will lose. The justices would then be able to say, well, the government can win here, or they can lose, or there's no presumption. Well, when we add these rules, and all of a sudden there's this idea that, well, if we're using strict scrutiny, the government shouldn't win. That alternative is then off the table. All right. So, in other words, even if the justices want to issue a conservative opinion, maybe they have a tough time doing that if they have to use strict scrutiny. So there's less kind of wiggle room to avoid a presumed outcome. When the menu of options is limited, they can't, sort of, to push that metaphor too far, they can't order off menu. So if a case presumes a particular outcome, like in strict scrutiny or rational basis, the effective ideology should be suppressed, right? If the government losing is typically a liberal position, the idea is that conservative justices have a tougher time avoiding the liberal outcome in cases that demand strict scrutiny. Okay, so in cases like that, ideology is going to be suppressed. The effective ideology is lower. If we go back to that knob metaphor, the knob is tuned down to 0 or 1 or 2 or whatever. It's pretty low, all right? To, excuse me, to show you this, like as an example, graphically anyhow, here, if you follow my cursor on the x-axis, we have rational basis cases, here in the middle intermediate, and then on the right side strict. On the y-axis, we have a high level of ideological discretion, so the justices can pretty much do what they want. And here on the lower end, we have low ideological discretion, so the outcome is sort of presumed, and the justices kind of have to come to a particular outcome. So what we see here is that because there's no presumed outcome for intermediate scrutiny, the justices are able to use ideology if they want, because it's not assumed that the outcome should be liberal or conservative. However, when there are presumed outcomes, like there are in rational basis here on the left side and strict scrutiny here on the right side, the level of ideological discretion is low. There's a presumed outcome. If it's a strict scrutiny case, it's likely that the government's going to lose, which tends to be a liberal position. So the justices can't sort of interject their ideology into a case like that as much as they might want to. Okay, so that's the legal presumptions model. That's one of the two sort of ideas about how the law can has this constraining capacity. The second one is called the rights protectiveness model. Again, if you think back to a number of slides ago, I'm talking about the level of rights protectiveness under intermediate scrutiny and strict scrutiny and rational basis. Here, the rights protectiveness suggests that the constraint isn't about the presumption of the outcome, but it's how rights protective each level of scrutiny is, right? The rule deems that the Constitution protects a right or not. So more scrutiny, so stricter scrutiny, suggests a greater constraint on ideological discretion because stricter scrutiny corresponds to more rights protectiveness. The government is more likely to lose, and the individual whose rights are being violated is more likely to win. Strict scrutiny demands the highest rights protectiveness, that is, so it has the least discretion. Intermediate scrutiny, there's sort of no, it's kind of rights protective, but not as rights protective as strict, so there's medium discretion. And rational basis demands little scrutiny or little rights protectiveness, meaning the government is more likely to win there, so there's high discretion, okay? If you look at the sort of graphical example here, kind of similar to what we saw under the other model, except here, instead of kind of making a triangle, it's linear, such that there's the highest level of ideological discretion for rational basis, a little bit less for intermediate, a lot less for strict scrutiny, because, excuse me, because the rights protectiveness decreases as we move up in the level of scrutiny. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The degree of ideological discretion decreases as we move up in scrutiny because the rights protectiveness increases with the level of scrutiny. So there's a negative relationship between scrutiny and the amount of ideological discretion. Okay, how do we test this? Well, Bartels uses the same case as Richards and Kritzer did, the graded case. So free speech before and after graded is really what we're looking at, okay? Remember that in the graded case, we found out that if the government regulation is content-based, meaning they're restricting what you can and can't say, the court has to use strict scrutiny. If the regulation is content neutral, meaning they're not regulating what you're actually saying, but they're regulating where and when you can say it, the court should use intermediate scrutiny. And if the regulation covers traditionally less protected speech, like hate, like fighting words or threats or something like that, the court should use rational basis. And then remember, there's this kind of fourth one that we didn't talk a great deal about, but if the issue doesn't actually meet the threshold to be a First Amendment issue, rational basis should be used, okay? So the idea is that these different rules, like the relationship between the type of regulation and the scrutiny demanded, it allows the justices to use ideology a different amount. So they might be able to use ideology more when they have to use strict scrutiny or less or something like that, right? The more constraining the rule, the less ideology can be used, okay? So let's look at Well, give me one more slide. Sorry. So Bartels uses the same cases, and he looks at before and after, the effect of ideology and the use of ideology before and after graded. Okay. So the dependent variable here, just like with Richards and Kritzer, it's a 0 if it's a pro-government vote, it's a 1 if it's a pro-free speech vote. The variable that we actually care about is the interaction between a justice's ideology and the level of scrutiny. Literally, the two columns are just multiplied together in the data, okay? This is what we call a conditional effect. So we can learn about the influence of ideology based on the level of scrutiny, okay? For those of you interested in calculus, we're looking at the instantaneous effect of one of the columns of data while holding the other one constant or partialing it away, okay? So it's the instantaneous rate of change. Okay, so what we're looking at here is pre-graded. So this is before the Supreme Court came up with those rules about what level of scrutiny should be used in the various speech cases, okay? Here on the y-axis, we have the influence of ideology on a pro-speech vote, okay? And here along the x-axis, we have the different types of regulations, right? So this first one, if you follow my cursor, threshold not met and less protected speech, those have low scrutiny requirements. They require rational basis, content neutral, intermediate, content-based, strict scrutiny, okay? So these little red circles here are the effect. So from, kind of 0 to 10 here, so low on the y-axis is a low influence of ideology, high on the y-axis is a lot of influence of ideology. For the threshold not met, it's very low, higher for less protected or low scrutiny, lower for content neutral, and then very high for content based. So again, these are all before. So pre-graded, ideology didn't matter for threshold issues, mattered a lot for less protected, mattered somewhat for content neutral, and mattered the most for content based. After graded, which is what you see with these blue circles, things changed, right? Because after, the court wasn't able to decide however it wanted anymore. Specific parts of the case, like the type of regulation, now related to type of scrutiny that should be used. So after graded, ideology all of a sudden mattered a lot for threshold issues. The influence of ideology was very high because they're using low scrutiny. It still mattered a lot for less protected. In fact, there's sort of no difference. It mattered the same amount. But all of a sudden, it mattered a lot more for intermediate cases, and it mattered much, much less than it used to for strict scrutiny cases or content-based restrictions, okay? So, Bartels is showing pretty much the same thing that Richards and Kritzer show. The rules established in the graded case actually mattered. The justices would come to different conclusions after graded than they would before graded because they were using these rules. But what Bartels is showing that's different from what we learned in the jurisprudential regimes lesson is that the rules, the justices aren't just following them because, oh, them's the rules. It's actually changing how much ideology is being used when the justices are making their decisions. Prior to graded, they could use ideology however much they wanted in any case. After graded, it restricted the use of ideology in certain cases, okay? So for strict scrutiny in particular, we see that really big effect where after graded, the effect of ideology is much lower than before. Well, the reason is because they can't really use ideology in strict scrutiny cases anymore. There's a presumed outcome and it's very rights protective, okay? However, for the other lower levels of scrutiny, like rational basis and intermediate, they are able to use ideology. So these rules actually free them to use ideology in those types of cases. What we see here, if we're trying to adjudicate between the rights protectiveness model and the presumed outcome model, it seems that the rights protectiveness model, there's a little more evidence. The more scrutiny applied, the less ideology can be used. That's what we see post-graded. That's consistent with the rights protectiveness model. The other model suggested that ideology would not be used for rights protectiveness, for rational basis cases. But let me go back to that graph real quick. We see here that ideology is used very much for rational basis cases. So it looks more like that negative relationship from the rights protectiveness model than it does that triangular relationship under the presumed outcomes model. Intermediate scrutiny kind of makes it a little weird. Intermediate scrutiny is kind of a toss-up, but I think that is definitely more consistent with the rights protectiveness model. So what does that mean for our conversation about the law? Well, we still know that it matters, but maybe it matters in different ways than traditional legal scholars may have considered it to matter. Law professors want it to be this sort of guiding force, this invisible hand, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. The law has no force because there's no enforcement mechanism. No justices are getting impeached for ignoring stare decisis, and they're never going to. So if there's no enforcement mechanism, it's not really a rule. But as we learn when we're talking about jurisprudential regimes, the justices pay attention to sort of internal rules that the court itself creates. They never say why the justices are compelled to follow those rules. And if you go back and look at the jurisprudential regimes lesson, that's kind of how I conclude. It's just not clear why they follow jurisprudential regimes, but they won't follow stare decisis. Well, Bartels comes along here and says, maybe it's not that they're actually compelled. Maybe they're freed to behave how they want in certain circumstances. And by the converse, maybe they're simply constrained in certain instances. They just can't use ideology as much as they want when it comes to strict scrutiny cases. And that really seems to be what's kind of driving the result here about the relationship between legal rules and outcomes. It's not so much that the law has force, it's other justices constraining the amount that ideology can be used. Okay, so that's it for this lesson here. Here's what we know about the law. It matters, but maybe not like we used to think it matters. All right, see you next time.